Whether you use Sublime Text to work with source code, prose, or anything in between, you may find that throughout the course of your day, you need to switch projects or switch tasks. And every time you do that, you need to work on a different set of files. And if you create a new window for every set of files you're working with, eventually you end up with window overload. Or worse, you're spending a lot of time recreating the list of files and folders that you had open when you go back to a previous task. As it turns out, Sublime has a function built in to support easily switching between different tasks within the same window. And that is why this week's video was all about projects and workspaces. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on projects and workspaces in Sublime Text. Now, before we get into that, as always, a reminder, if you're finding the videos on the channel in any way useful or helpful, I'd love to know about it. So please use those buttons down below the video to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And if you have any questions or comments on the content of this video or any of the videos on the channel, or you have a suggestion for another Sublime Text topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, leave those down in the comments section below the video or hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. The topic of today's video is projects and workspaces, two concepts that work hand in Sublime Text. And as has been common in recent videos, there is official documentation for this, which I have linked down in the description of the video. There's also unofficial documentation that may have a little bit more detail on things that the official documentation doesn't have. So there's a link to that in the documentation as well. Now, what we're going to be focusing on mostly in this video is the contents of this project menu here. And in particular, this allows you to open a project or workspace, switch the current project or workspace in this window with another one. Quick Switch Project does the same thing, but it offers you the information in a different format, which we'll see in just a moment. There's also a list of recent items, and there are items for saving the current window project and closing it if we want, editing the file. These are all things we're going to cover throughout this video, creating new workspaces, saving them, and adding folders. Now, one thing I like to point out before we get going, that my quick switch project has a key binding here of Control-Alt-P, and that's something I added myself. On Linux, the default key binding for this command is Control-Alt-P. On Mac OS, it's Control-Command-P, but on Windows, there isn't a defined key binding for it. And I use Linux a lot and I switch projects a lot, so I like having a key binding for that. So I set up my Windows Sublime Text to have the same key binding. And if you want to do that, you can go into your preferences key bindings. I'm going to maximize that window. And this binding right here, Control-Alt-P to the command prompt select workspace, is what has set up that key binding for me. You could, of course, choose whatever key you find most appropriate if you're already using Control-Alt-P for something. But I thought I'd point that out because otherwise you might get confused that my menu item has a key binding and yours doesn't. And I'll also point out that we're going to be working with Sublime project files throughout this video, which should come as no surprise. And I am using the package dev package, which provides better syntax highlighting for projects and also snippets that work within them as well. So if you want to use the same key bindings or see the same thing that I'm seeing in the video, you should install that package. And there's a video on the channel that goes into some other details on what package dev can provide for you. But let's go ahead and dive on into projects and workspaces in Sublime Text. Now, if you've used Sublime for any appreciable length of time, you'll know that you can do something like have a file open, make some changes, maybe even change the layout and have some unsaved text in a file that doesn't even exist on disk yet, and then go ahead and exit Sublime. And when you restart Sublime, it comes back to the same state that it was in before. The layout is the same, that unsaved file is on the right, the changes still exist on the left. And any files you had open would also be there, and any folders you had open would also be there. This even persists things like view specific settings. If you turned word wrap off before you quit, it would be restored. This happens on an application-wide basis when you quit Sublime, and it's controlled by a setting called hot exit, which is turned on by default. So you may not even know that that's something you could turn off if you want to. If you turn that setting off, whenever you try to quit Sublime, it will ask you if you want to save changes because it will close every single file. And when you restart it, you just end up with that one empty window. It is possible to configure Sublime to save that state not on an application basis, but also a window by window basis. So if you imagine a situation where maybe you're a software developer and you're working on two different projects, sometimes you work on one, sometimes you work on the other. If you always have the same files open, it makes sense to save the state of what you're working on so that you can come back to it later when you're switching between projects. Or if you're working on web pages, you may have more than one web page that you're working on. And you may have multiple workflows within your project. For example, you may focus one day more on the content of your web page and on another day more the styling and layout. And in that case, maybe you want to have a split layout like we see here so you can see the HTML and the CSS at the same time. But once the style of your page is locked in, you can focus more on the content, so you just dedicate the whole window to that page to be able to see more of it. These are things that are reasons why you might want to use projects and workspaces. Now, anytime you create a project, you're also implicitly creating a workspace. The inverse is not true. It's also possible to create a workspace without creating a project. And we're going to show examples of both of those things here in just a second. Now, all things being equal, the reason why you might want to use a project instead is because you have more ability to customize how that project is going to work. As we saw in a previous video, you can do project-specific settings. So if you're working on a project where you're collaborating with others and the mandate is tabs should be physical tabs and not spaces, and that tabs should be 3 characters and not say 4 or 8 or 2 or something. And those aren't settings that agree with what you normally work with. If you used a project, you could say that within that project, set these settings this way, but elsewhere they stay at your default. And as we saw, you can also do things like change color schemes as well. There are also some other customization options that you have when you're working with a project in that sense. So to demonstrate some of those things now, let's go ahead and close this and get back to a clean window. So what we're going to do here is open a couple of folders and demonstrate some things here. Now I should point out that you don't have to use folders when you're using Sublime, and that also applies to using projects and workspaces. If you don't want to have folders open, you don't have to have folders open. The same things will still apply except for customizing the folders. But you can still have a window that has no folders open that just has a group of files opened and positioned and still do the same stuff. And we're going to add a couple of folders to this, and there's a couple of ways to add folders. If you go into the File menu, you can choose the Open Folder option. Also, under the Project menu, there's an item labeled Add Folder to Project. Both of those will open a file dialog for you to browse. What I'm going to do is use the other way to do that, which is to drag and drop. And I'm going to drag in this folder, which is the source for my override audit package, which was the subject of a previous video, and also this folder, which is a part of my website that is the documentation for my project. And this part is HTML, that part's the source code. If this is the documentation, maybe I need to refer to the code as I'm writing the documentation and things of that nature. So this is handy. It's kind of a bummer that both folders are named Override Audit. And I could try to remember that the top one is the code and the bottom one is the documentation, that this one has capitals, so that's the code. This is something that you can customize by using a project. So the first thing we would do is go to the Project menu and choose Save Project As. It's going to ask us what we want to save this file as. Now, the file you save has to have the extension sublime-project, or Sublime won't recognize it as a project file. Sublime uses the native operating system save dialogues in this case, and sometimes those dialogues don't add the extension. So when in doubt, add the extension or Sublime won't be able to recognize the file. And we might name this override audit save.sublime-project like so. You can save projects anywhere you like. You could save, some people put them directly into the folders that they are most associated with, and some people keep them segregated out and in their own folder. For example, they might have a folder named projects that has just their Sublime project files in it. Whichever one of those you use, that's entirely up to you. Sublime doesn't care either way. I like to put these things inside of the folder, so I'm going to go ahead and add them inside the override audit source code in this case and hit save. And we can immediately see that that project file has appeared in the sidebar. And we can open this project file to see its contents, and we could click on it in the sidebar. You could open it via file open. And another thing you can do is use the project edit project menu item, and when you do that, the file just automatically opens up. And here we can see the two folders that are currently open here in my copy of Sublime. And the paths that you see here are relative to the Sublime project file. So the one with the path of dot, that's stored inside of that path. So that's the code. That's the place that the project is stored. And the other one is a file on my desktop that's a subdirectory inside of a directory that contains my whole website. There are a few items that you can add to each of these individual path items to modify them. And the full list is listed in that official documentation that's linked in the description. So we're only going to cover a couple of things in here. One key that we can add in here is the name key. And again, I'm using package dev to get these snippets. If there's a name key in here, then instead of naming the folder whatever the folder is named, you can provide a name. So I could say code here. And down for this one, I could add a name here and say docs like this. And as soon as I save this project, both of those folders changed their name. Now, because the folder layout kind of changed here, the names of them changed, Sublime automatically folds all of the folders up. So we're going to have to, in this case, click them up. But we can see I now have the code for the package, and I also have the documentation for the package, both in that one thing, and it's easier for me to see what they are now. You can imagine if you had multiple related folders open, how this can make your life a little easier in keeping track of them if their names are kind of similar. There are other options we can add in here as well. Now, Sublime has global options for what is and is not referenced in the sidebar, because the contents of the sidebar is what powers things like the symbol index and go to anything. And we may want to modify that as well. For example, the Sublime project file is visible in the code folder. And in this case, I don't want that to be present in there, because if I want to open it, I can use that menu item. I just want that folder to show me the actual code. So I could change the global option to hide that file, but in some projects, I like it to be there and to be able to see it and remember that it's under source control, for example. So what do we do in that situation? That's a situation where you'd want to use a project. So I can say up here in the code, I can add an item for file exclude patterns. And again, this is documented in that official documentation. Check the links in the description. This is a list of, this is very similar to the preferences setting of the same name, what files should not be included for this exact folder. And I could say star.sublime-project files. And as soon as I save the project, again, the structure of the thing changed, so the folders folded up. But if I unfold them, you'll see the Sublime project file is no longer present in there. Now, there are a few other things that we can do with a project here as well. So the first thing we're going to do is choose Project and Close Project to put this window back to the empty state that it was originally in, to start a whole new item. And I'm going to drag another folder in from my desktop, and this is a C# application written in .NET Core 3. And the first thing we're going to notice is that there is a lot of content in here. There's a bin folder and an obj folder. And we don't want to get bogged down into the minutia of C#, but These are both folders that we could easily delete if we wanted to, and the tools for compiling our program would bring them back when we compile it. Most of the files in there are binary in nature and things that are used by the tools in use, and they're not anything we need to look at, so we don't really want to see them over there in the sidebar. So in this case, again, projects to the rescue if you want to turn something like this off only in some cases. And again, to do that, we would go to the project menu and say save project as. And like last time, I'm going to go ahead and save that inside of the folder where this application is stored. And we're going to call it hello world dot sublime dash project like so. And once that's saved, again, we can see the project pop in. And this time, let's use that to open the file. So we can say project here and locate the hello world.sublime project file. And again, the folder here is dot because this project is saved inside the folder. Now, there are some items we can do here. In the same way that we used file exclude patterns to hide a specific file, we can use folder exclude patterns to exclude whole folders as well. And again, this is something that is documented in that documentation linked in the description. It's also a standard Sublime preference that applies globally, and we can customize it here. And in this case, I could say the bin folder is a folder that I'm not interested in seeing in the list. And as soon as I save, the bin folder goes away. And I could also add in obj as well. And now that's gone as well. Now note when I open the go to anything, the list of files is more severely constrained. We can see our project file, the source code, and the CS proj file, which is a tool that's used by the C# compiler. So we've already made our lives that much nicer in this particular case because all those files that have nothing to do with anything as far as our coding is concerned are now removed from the sidebar, and they make everything clearer. If you're a Node.js developer, it's common to want to remove the Node modules folder from the sidebar because it's very large, contains a lot of files, often with redundant names, and it makes things like this tricky to pull off. Now, again, as we said previously, there are other things we can do here, and I'm not going to talk about in detail the other things on the folder, along with being able to exclude specific files by pattern or folders by pattern. You can also specify include options for those things, in which case, instead of displaying everything but these files, you're specifically saying what it is you want to include, and then you can also exclude from there as well. You can also override binary file settings on a project by project basis. So if you sometimes need files to be treated as binary so that they don't get searched, but other times you want them to be searched, you could do that in a project. And you can also control what files get indexed as well, which are things that can populate the global symbol list, which in our case is just the main and the namespace that this program currently contains. But there are other keys that we can include in here, and one of those we saw in the previous video on settings is the settings key. Any settings that are editor settings, that's things that control the editor and not a component of Sublime and not the application behavior as a whole, like the theme or the list of ignored packages. If they're in this settings key, they'll apply to just this project. Again, as I said, you might say the tab size is 3 for this project because I'm working on this for a client that likes a 3-character tab for their indents and things of that nature. Just for demonstration purposes here, we're going to do what we did in the previous video, which is change the color scheme. The default is monokai.sublime color scheme, but we could change it to say mariana.sublime color scheme instead. That's another color scheme that shifts with Sublime. So now anything that's considered a part of this project has this color scheme applied to it. Other things that you can include in here include build systems. Now, we did a whole series of videos on build systems, and if you're unfamiliar with build systems and what they're for and how they work, you can check out that. There's a whole playlist linked on the channel that goes through in a lot of detail on those things. But we can have a key in our project named build systems, and this is a list of build systems. So we can have one or more JSON objects in here, and each one of those is essentially what you would put in a Sublime build file, allowing you to have one or more build systems that apply to this project and this project only. I have a couple of those built, and to save time, I'm just going to go ahead and paste them in. And the one thing that's different about putting a build system in this file as opposed to in a Sublime build file is that in a Sublime build file, only a variant of a build in the variant key inside of a build requires a name to name that specific variant. In a project, every build system has to have a specified name. And that's because build systems generally get their name from the name of the Sublime build file that they are contained in. And here they're not contained in a Sublime build file, so we need to tell Sublime. But otherwise, we have a shell command that runs either .NET build or .NET run and a selector so that they're automatically selected. And of course, you could do things like custom targets, variants, platform specific keys. If you want to do something like that, you can add the custom targets and change how that works if you wanted this to be interactive, all of that sort of stuff. You could even have a file regex in here if you wanted to navigate errors. And I'm going to go ahead and click Save. Now, we're going to note that if I go into the Tools Build System menu, up at the top under Automatic, there's a couple of build systems whose names should be pretty familiar because they're coming from this exact project, Hello App Build and Hello App Run. And they're segregated from the rest of the builds by these separator lines to give us an indication that they are project specific. And you could, of course, select one of those specifically if you wanted to, or you could leave it as automatic as I have done here. And now if we were to open the CS file, the C# file here, when I try to do the build for the first time by pushing Control B, that's Command B on Mac OS, I haven't built C# yet, so it wants to know there's more than one build that applies, and it's showing me my two project-specific builds. And I can choose to build the app or run it. So I will choose the run, which also builds the application. Anyway, that's just the way .NET works. And the build panel will open up, and we can see it says Hello World, and we're all good. So it has successfully executed the program. And then, of course, the next time I push Control B, it will just run the program again like that. Now, if you've worked on build systems and ran into situations where when you're working on this project, you want something to work in one way, and in that project, you want it to work another way, this is an example of how you could make that happen. You could make a project-specific build system to do that very thing. To finish this first part of our discussion on projects, I'd like to point out that when you create a project file, Sublime will also create a similarly named Sublime Workspace file in the exact same location as the project. And those two items are interrelated. The workspace stores the layouts of the windows and all of that information, and the project stores the names of the folders and your customized settings. If you're using source control and you're keeping your project files inside of your project directory, the general rule of thumb is you would add the Sublime project file to source control, but you wouldn't add the Sublime workspace file. And that's because the project file might contain your build systems and it might contain your custom settings. The workspace file, on the other hand, is going to change with practically anything you do in that project. Change the window layout, choose a new command from the command palette that you never chose before, open files you haven't previously opened. Any of those things and more will change the state of the window that's saved, which means anytime you do anything, that file will always appear dirty in your source control system. Now, of course, if you're only using the Sublime project file for the folders and you're not taking advantage of settings or exclusions or build systems, then you may not need to put your Sublime project file in source control because it's easily rebuilt. And of course, if you keep those project files out in a completely other directory, then it wouldn't be part of that repository anyway. But maybe you keep those projects in source control in some other repository. That's all up to you. Now, it's worth noting that you can have more than one workspace associated with a project if you want to. So for example, if I use Quick Switch project and swap to the Hello World project, that's going to bring that project back up like so, and it's saved the same state as we just saw in the previous part of the video. If we go up to the project menu, there's an item here labeled new workspace for project. And if we hit that, we get a brand new window, and I'm going to maximize this. And we can see it's got the exact same content in the left-hand side. And as a matter of fact, if we were to go up here to edit project, it thinks that it's using the exact same project because it is. This workspace is separate from the previous one. So I could say make this a 2-column layout and open the program over here. And then what we would do is say project save workspace as to save this workspace. And we might say hello world to call like so, for example. And then we can go ahead and close this window because we no longer need it. Now, over here in this window, this is our original item. And if we went up to the project menu, we could say in open recent, we can see there's a hello world to call. And I can pick that and it opens a window and there's my other workspace ready to go. We can go ahead and close that again. We could also use quick switch project, and we can see that in here as well. If we want the 2-column version, we can choose that to quickly swap this window to that one. Or if we decide we want the original one, we can get that one as well. So now you can start to see the situations where you might have different layouts of files and panes and things of that nature for different tasks that you're doing. Researching something versus implementing it, working on a library versus working on the application that uses that library, working on the style of your web page versus working on the actual content. You may not need to see the style information in that case, and you can devote more space to the editing of the actual file, things of that nature. One last thing to say here is that although every time you create a project, you get at least one workspace, and as we just saw, you can have more than one workspace in the same project if you want to, it is possible to have a workspace without a project. If you don't need any of that customization of changing the names of folders or settings or exclusions or build systems or any of that, and you just have a couple of different sets of files that you like to work with, and you want the states of those to be saved, that is possible as well without a project. So let's go ahead again and go to Project, Close Project from the menu here, just to put this back to an empty window as if we just started Sublime. So for this example, I'm just going to drag one folder in here, and this is just the documentation part of the website for Override Audit, and I might have a couple of files open in here. So let's say we make this a 2-column layout, and we might open the overrides file in this one and the index over in this one, and maybe we might even have a CSS file open if we care. If we go up to the project menu, we could do save project as we did previously. If you do that, you get a Sublime project file and a Sublime workspace file with the same name. We can also choose Save Workspace as you can see here, even though there's not currently a project. And when I hit that item, it's again going to ask me for the location. I'm going to, in this case, drop it on my desktop. And we can see that it's going to save a Sublime Workspace file. And the same thing applies here as before. Some operating systems might not put the extension. Make sure the extension of the file you save is Sublime-Workspace. So I might say OA docs.sublime-workspace like so. And I can go ahead and hit save. And there we go. Now, if I went into the quick chooser here, we can see it there. I could say that right now I'm working on my Hello World project and maybe adding some more exclamation points because I'm real excited about this. And then I realized I was going to work on the documentation for Override Audit. I just thought of something I forgot to put in there. I can go ahead and type OA to filter this list. Here's the project if I want to work on the project as a whole. And here's just the documentation. And if I hit that, I still get the saved layout restored for me the same files and everything that I had open. But up here, there's still not a project for me to edit. Now you will note that close project is still listed here, and that's because all windows, even if they don't have a dedicated project associated with them, still contain project data. That's the part of the window state that stores the folders that are open in that window and other things of that nature. Using save project as formalizes that you want that to be saved and persisted to disk. Windows still tend to have projects in them anyway. We refer to that as anonymous project data. And that's why you can see close project here, which you could use to put this window back to a clean state, but you can't edit this particular project. If you work with various sets of files and you don't need that project customization, you could just use a few workspaces strategically placed to be able to jump around between files that you're working on and sets of files and folders and projects and not have an overload of windows. So there we have projects and workspaces in Sublime Text. The workspace in a window allows you to save the layout and state of that window in a named file if you would like to. And you can also use a project file to have more control over what appears in the sidebar of the window, to have control of settings, to have control of project build systems that only apply in certain key situations and otherwise hide themselves. And these are some really nice ways to help streamline your workflow in Sublime when you jump between different sets of files and different projects and different even ways of working. And I hope that this has helped demystify a little bit the topic of projects and workspaces in Sublime. So I'd love to hear from you. If it did, use those buttons down below the video to subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And if you have any further questions about this topic, because it is kind of a big topic and you want me to explain things a little bit more, or you have questions about other videos on the channel, or you have topics that you would like me to cover that I haven't already in a future video on the channel, leave all of that information down in the comment section below the video. You can also hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. But until the next video, this is ODATNerd asking you to please have a sublime day.